be looking at the presidency and the policies and a lot of the political, social, multiple changes that were taking place throughout what's known as the Reagan era, throughout the 1980s, and what is sometimes called the Reagan Revolution. And one of the big things that we are seeing, what this Reagan Revolution, the concept that it really revolves around, and what many would argue if it is truly a revolution, which of course, that word depends on the person, if that's the right word to use. But what we can certainly say, it is a triumph and a movement nationally towards conservatism. It is a conservative movement and the rise of a conservative movement and that becoming more part of mainstream and pushing America back kind of towards the center into more conservative political thinking on the whole, as opposed to that being more of a minority or even kind of a fringe movement. Now, we've seen this kind of growing movement towards conservatism, keeping in mind, make sure you just kind of operating off the notion that we know the difference between conservatism versus, say, liberalism. Conservatives typically wanting less government and, more restrained government, less social programs or no social programs at all, and those kind of things, to more liberal attitudes about government, that government should be more active, that government should promote social justice and social welfare and be, overall larger, more government apparatus in order to accomplish those kind of things. And we've seen this, conflict between those two different political ideologies for a long time, and we've seen this, rise of sort of more grassroots conservative movements starting to gain more steam really for quite some time. It never really goes away ever. It's not like it's ever gone. But certainly, remember Goldwater in 1964, that was kind of one of the first, after the New Deal, that is, after the New Deal era, where you've seen that, growing conversation about less government and, we need to be getting away from these government programs and the welfare state and all those kind of things. We saw Nixon go after that. That was part of the Southern strategy, was this kind of growing resentment of government interference in things and government involvement, whether it was in economics, whether it was in civil rights, all that kind of stuff. And that comes to, this major, what some would look at as kind of a conservative revolution by the 1980s. So the 1980s, with President Reagan leading the way, becomes this sort of new day for conservative political thinking, for the conservative right, for the right, wing movement of politics and of society. So when we talk about the right, that means the more conservative, part of the political spectrum. And in the 80s, we see the rise of this so-called new right, kind of a resurgence of that, a resurgence of conservatism. The old right, conservatism, it's not the whole idea of being conservative is certainly not a new idea. But there's kind of a new brand, a new kind of aspect, a new characteristic of this right-wing conservative movement that was gaining prevalence and becoming mainstream throughout the 1980s. Because the old right, the old kind of view of conservatism, it was mainly about being conservative economically, low taxes and low government spending and those sorts of things. Not having a whole lot of government interference in the economy, that sort of stuff. Let the economy do as it wants to do, being pro-business, stuff like that. What happens in the 80s is that old right kind of merges with this with new forces to create this new right where it is, not that it's not about economics, but it's about more than that. It's also about social issues. They're bringing in social issues and moral issues and things like that into their political platform as well. So it's kind of the same of this old conservatism, the so-called old right, but a little bit different as well because it is less, and that's less of their focus about the economy and regulation of business. It's not that that's not a part of their brand, because it is. But they are bringing in these social and cultural concerns. So it's largely a response to, or in many ways, it's a response to, the counterculture of the 1960s. It's a response to, in some ways the civil rights movement and federal intervention into civil rights, affirmative action, those sorts of things. It is a reaction to the liberalism of the New Deal, of the Great Society, of all of those things that had been implemented over the past several decades. This new conservative movement, this new right, opposed a lot of those things. They opposed what they saw as extreme or radical feminism. They opposed, some of the new embracing of different social norms and lifestyles of the counterculture and youth culture and all of those things. And it's, a reaction to those changes. It's a reaction to those political ideas. It's also a reaction, or it happens because of demographic shifts within the country. By this point, the country was aging. The population, the number of Americans over the age of 65 was a huge growing group, and still is. Older Americans were becoming a big part of the population, and therefore a big part of, public opinion, and a big voting bloc, a big part of interest, and that's going to influence politics. We talked about, and we hit on this in chapter 39, population had been shifting for decades, more people moving to the south and to the west. And those areas were growing in population. And if they're growing in population, that means they're growing in political power. That means more congressional votes. It means their voice is more politically relevant. And those areas, this again was all part of, Nixon's Southern strategy. Those areas, the South, the West, you're talking about a lot of retirees, a lot of people over the age of 65, a lot of people that were far more religious and therefore more conservative about a lot of those things. And so with those areas growing, those attitudes that they support, they were affiliated with, those kind of things they supported, all of that was just fertile ground for Republicans and for conservatism. So that is starting to grow. The new right is supported by what becomes called the moral majority. And the moral majority, so this is just a part of it, is supporting the new right, kind of further represents those ideas. And you hear this same concept. The moral majority refers to an actual organization, but the beliefs that they were based upon is what today you would hear called the religious right. The moral majority is this represents this massive, revival of evangelical religion. It is an actual organization, but it is an evangelical group, based off of evangelical Christian principles. But they are seeking, to influence political change. Think of it as an interest group, basically. But the moral majority, which was founded by this person, Jerry Falwell, who's a former Baptist minister that starts this, what becomes a massive, throughout the 1980s, political organization to support this, religiously based social agenda. It's about social issues. So it's not, it's not so much about a religious issue, a religious agenda, except to the extent that their social beliefs, their beliefs about social and moral issues were influenced by their religious belief, by evangelical Christianity. So the moral majority, and this is again part of the new right, it is anti-abortion, anti-feminism, anti-gay rights, anti-pornography, anti-sexual promiscuity. Think about a lot of the, not just the counterculture, but other kinds of minority movements, feminism. They would be advocates for, what they would call, we hear these words all the time, traditional family values and strong families and all those kinds of things. They are in favor of school prayer and things like that, arguing that, the nation's moral fabric was tearing to pieces and it needed to be brought back up. So those ideas, of course, have not gone anywhere. That's still, of course, what identifies the religious right today. The moral majority, though, this is the actual political organization that would, through lobbying of Congress or organizing events or education and different things like that, we're actually seeking to influence policy. it sort of kind of still, it eventually breaks up. They have a lot of financial scandals. There's a bunch of mess that happens that is neither here nor there for us. Another story for another day. But what was left of it is kind of called something else nowadays. But certainly those ideas have not gone anywhere. But these are the kind of things that would have been certainly a minority kind of fringe sort of movement decades before, but this is becoming part of the mainstream by the 1980s. So this new conservative revolution, who becomes sort of the face of it and leading it in the national government, of course, becomes President Ronald Reagan, who was elected in 1980. So let's just take a look at, really just want to look at that election, mainly just in regards to Reagan himself. So in the election of 1980, Jimmy Carter, I talked about Jimmy Carter right before the break. Hopefully you watched some of that. Seeking re-election against the Republican candidate, Ronald Reagan. And we know that things were pretty troubled, and the mood of the country in a lot of ways was kind of depressed, as a result of from Watergate on in the 1970s had been sort of a lot of times are, but sort of a gloomy time for a lot of people. There was not, faith in government had been shaken. Faith in American position in the world and American values and all of that had really been shaken for a variety of reasons, from the Watergate scandal to the United States' loss in Vietnam, and to kind of lackluster presidencies of Ford and Carter. And so the election of 1980, you have Reagan coming in, running as the Republican candidate, and it's for a lot of people just sort of kind of a breath of fresh air. Reagan, in contrast to Carter, who tended to be, as I mentioned, kind of a little bit gloomy, overly preachy, kind of scolding Americans for their lack of this and lack of that, and you need to do this, you need to do that. Reagan was incredibly optimistic. Reagan had this great sense of optimism, cheerful, just kind of seemed to a lot of folks like just an all-around nice guy. And he's a champion of conservative principles, so he was advocating and was campaigning for all those conservative principles that we were just talking about with the new right and all of those kind of things. But he was charming and he was cheerful and he was funny. And Reagan, if you're not aware of his background, he's from California. He actually was an actor before he got into politics. He's done several movies, mostly B movies, but became the head of the Screen Actors Guild, which is the labor union for actors. And that's how we got into politics and all of that. But that time in front of the camera, you can imagine, did him a lot of good. He knew how to work a crowd. He knew how to make a speech. He was, just quick on the uptick as far as cracking a joke or telling a story and just being very personable. And that was something that was quite refreshing to a lot of people, not just folks that supported his more conservative policies. So that upbeat attitude, knew how to work the press, just a master at that. Just kind of one of those that sticks out as being kind of even was known as the great communicator for being able to communicate with people and get his message across in a very cheerful kind of a way. So it's no surprise that Reagan wins the election in 1980 in an absolute landslide, defeats Carter soundly. Carter tried to kind of paint Reagan and the conservative thing as being potentially dangerous, that Reagan's going to come in and dismantle all these government programs that so many people rely on, like Medicare and all those things, which part of Reagan was kind of campaigning on some of that, getting rid of a lot of government infrastructure, getting rid of a lot of the excess and cutting programs and cutting spending and all those kind of things. Nevertheless, of course, Reagan wins in a landslide. So let's talk a little bit about Reagan's policies, some of the things that he implements or tries to implement and how they work. So Reagan, part of this conservative agenda, this whole idea of less government, that's a big key component of Reagan's policy and has been of the Republican Party ever since, really always was, of less government. That government, or he famously says, and you still hear a lot of Republican leaders say this, that government isn't the solution, government is the problem, that we have to get rid of so much bureaucracy. We have to get rid of so many regulations. We got to stop all the spending. We shouldn't be spending all this money on government programs and all those kinds of things. So cutting spending, lowering taxes, all that kind of stuff is a great part of his program. Now, his economic policy, which later gets labeled Reaganomics, is the overall economic policy that he supports. Another technical name for what an economist would call it is what's called supply side economics. So Reaganomics is kind of the media sort of, public relations kind of the name, but the actual economic term is supply side economics. And what Reaganomics or supply side economics is all about is reducing taxes. So reducing taxes, reducing regulations, reducing spending, cutting all that stuff so that individuals and businesses, there will be more people are taking home more money. That if you lower the tax rate, particularly on those with the highest incomes, that if you lower taxes on folks that make more money, and if you lower taxes on corporations and businesses and all of that, then that gives them more money to spend, more in their pocket, more that they're taking home and less that the government's taking. That gives them more money to spend and buy things, and that stimulates economic growth. That if you're giving people more spending power, then that's going to stimulate growth of the economy. The economy will do well because of increased purchasing power. And then on the business end, that if businesses are being taxed less and there's less regulation and there's just less government involvement, then those businesses will have more income and more ability to expand and therefore hire more people and bring in more jobs and create more businesses. That if you free up more money, taking maybe less taxes, there's more money for people to spend, there's more money for business investment, and the economy is going to grow. So this is a complete about face from the economic thinking that had really dominated since the New Deal. The whole idea that the New Deal was based on, the Great Society was based on, is what an economist would call Keynesian economics, which suggests that it's government spending that stimulates the economy, that the government needs to spend, operate with some sort of a deficit in order to stimulate the economic growth. That's what the New Deal was based on, Great Society and all of that. Reaganomics or supply side economics, goes against that. And so this was quite baffling and astonishing to a lot of people, kind of a complete about face about that whole principle. And it's very similar to, and critics and supporters alike, mostly critics, would argue that this was like the whole idea is that it creates this whole trickle-down effect. The idea being that if you help the people at the top of the economic ladder, if you give those people tax cuts and give those people incentives, then those good effects will eventually trickle down to the lower classes, to people of the working class and so forth, because there'll be more jobs for them and stuff like that. So Reaganomics, that's the basic principle of it. That is going to include, here's how it was implemented, tax cuts. There were significant tax cuts, some of the first big major tax cuts in a long, long time, particularly, again, for people at the top of the economic ladder, for people that made lots and lots of money. Huge amounts of decreases in income tax rates. They were slashed in the 1980s. Specific inheritance taxes, estate taxes, all those kind of things were cut, but those are the kind of things that only people with large amounts of money are even going to be affected by. So again, it mostly were tax cuts that greatly affected people at the top of the economic ladder. Huge spending cuts. Big part of this whole conservative revolution of the new right is cutting government spending, not so much money being spent on government programs and assistance and things like that. So there was lots and lots of spending cuts, cutting billions of dollars in domestic programs, cutting things from food stamps, not getting rid of them totally, but significant cuts to their budgets of food stamps, student loans, and other education kind of programs, housing, lots of different things that were, had been implemented over many decades. Getting rid of a lot of that stuff. Now, when Reagan campaigns, he's promising even bigger stuff, like getting rid of entire cabinet departments and that sort of thing, which he does not do. Does not touch Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, those are kind of the ones that, because so many people depend on them, it's kind of politically not very feasible to get rid of those as much as people might campaign against them. Another part of Reaganomics, or this whole economic agenda, is deregulation. What are regulations? Rules, policies, okay, all kinds of rules about industry and different things like that. And throughout the Reagan administration, you see a lot of deregulation, which means getting rid of a lot of those rules, loosening a lot of those policies, as they would put it, kind of, getting their, hands from behind their bags, so they're not just tied up in all these government regulations, to make it easier for businesses to operate, to get government out of businesses, get them not breathing down businesses' neck. This is, again, part of that whole idea of government being the problem, not the solution. So we have to get rid of some of those things. So they loosen a lot of regulations about a lot of different kinds of industries, whether they're environmental regulations, and being a lot more lax about that, either by getting rid of regulations or just not enforcing a lot of stuff as easily, or cutting the power of certain agencies to regulate a lot of things. A lot of deregulation of the financial industry, of savings and loan and all that stuff. Arguably, and again, it all depends on a lot of people's interpretation of things, but the more recent economic crisis, 2008 and all of that, a lot of economists would point the beginnings of that kind of happened here with deregulation and making a lot of what became quite risky behavior okay, or legal anyway. But that's another story for another time. And that's happening not just in the United States, it was kind of the international trend towards that anyway. But these are kind of the three major components of Reaganomics, of his economic policy of cutting spending, cutting taxes, getting the government out of businesses' hair, and trying to make it easier for them to operate. And if you notice, these are still, core economic beliefs of conservatives today, Republicans today. Those are still the things they always want, those three things. They want tax cuts, they want spending cuts, they want deregulation, and they don't want a lot of interference and mingling and meddling, as they might say, of the government into business and industry and all of that. Now, as far as the effects of all of this, if it worked, depends on who you ask. As far as the tax cuts and so forth, those things, like I said, they really only put more money in the hands of people in higher incomes. It is arguable, and again, different people on different sides of the spectrum would tell you different things, but it's arguable as to how much that really helped people on the lower end of things, if that trickle-down effect actually works. So a lot of economists would tell you it doesn't, some people would tell you it does. But one thing that this does do, the thing we haven't gotten to just yet, is this is accompanied at the same time, even though we say there's less spending, there's actually more spending, because one of the other things that Reagan wants is massive military spending. And so this is all accompanied with massive military build up. And so it actually results in very big deficits where the government's operating, spending more money that's being brought in. And so, part of what Reagan originally, was campaigning on was a balanced budget, that we're going to only spend what we're bringing in. That ends up never being possible because there is such increased spending on the other end. And with all the tax cuts, just didn't bring in the money to cover those things. So it does leave huge deficits, which, we still operate on huge deficits. And the deficit is actually much larger when Reagan leaves office than it was when he came into office. But one thing that you can say about that, part of what Reagan campaigned on, part of what this conservative movement was about, was less government programs, less of a welfare state. Now, they don't dismantle Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, that doesn't go anywhere. But by creating those deficits, it's sort of almost impossible now to really, for it to be politically and economically feasible to expand a lot of those programs too much or to bring in too many new ones. So while they don't dismantle the welfare state, it certainly, they kind of keep it from growing, and it sort of definitely puts a halt on it, shrinks it, and makes it very difficult for any, subsequent administrations to want to expand that really any further, because those deficits just kind of make that not really feasible. It more becomes a question, and a big part of the economic conversation ever since has been controlling the deficit. not letting it get too big. We hear all those, it comes up the conversation, the debt ceiling, all that kind of stuff. That's been a conversation ever since. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that foreign policy, because again, part of the economic side of things has to do with that increased military spending. So first, let's look at Reagan's position on the Cold War and how he does a complete turnaround almost of what we saw, certainly with Nixon, and then also, with Ford and Carter. Reagan is very adamant in his position on communism and containment. Reagan is very strong on he says that he doesn't want to contain communism, but to defeat it. Nixon had this detente, we have to relax tensions, it doesn't make sense for us to always be at each other's throats, we need to pick and choose, we should be engaging with communist nations. Reagan says, nope, none of that. We need to be working to defeat communist nations. He openly comes into office, calls the Soviet Union the evil empire, uses incredibly strong language to denounce the Soviet Union and to make it clear that the United States intended to show a position of great strength and to come with great strength. He's not opposed to negotiation at all, so he's not like a no talking, we're only going to fight kind of a thing, but he believes in coming to that negotiation table from a position of absolute strength, that we have to show that strength and military power to give us the upper hand when it comes to negotiations and so forth. Interestingly enough, with all that rhetoric and evil empire this and all that kind of stuff, we will see Reagan is also, partially, gets some credit for ending the Cold War and being more open with the Soviet Union, but we'll get some of that stuff later. Okay, so one of the ways that Reagan wants to do that is through massive military buildup, massive military spending. We had seen some efforts in some previous administrations to kind of not make huge cuts to that, but not try to ramp it up too much, to kind of not rely on that, to rely on diplomacy more. That was the part of the whole détente thing. Well, détente is dead, come the Reagan administration. Reagan wants massive military buildup. He wants to initiate a new arms race with the Soviet Union, mainly because he believes, and he ends up being quite right about this, that the Soviet Union won't be able to keep up. He's like, this is something that we can do. We can initiate this arms race. They won't be able to. It will bankrupt them, and that will cause communism to implode from within. And that's pretty much what happened when it's all said and done. So more military spending, including a proposed initiative, a proposed idea, this ends up just being a proposal, that Reagan comes up with and talks about and addresses the public about, called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. And this was this whole, what seemed at the time, it seemed a little bit less far-fetched now, I guess, with more modern technology, but in the early 80s, this was seemed completely wacky to a lot of people. It was this whole idea of a defense system in space, of satellites and stuff in space, equipped with lasers and other sorts of weapons, to shoot down any missiles that might be fired at the United States. So to intercept and fire, and destroy any kind of missiles or weapons that were launched toward the United States from space. And he goes on TV and talks about it. And, scientists, even a lot of scientists were saying, this is not attainable, we don't have the technology to do this, it's kind of ridiculous. A lot of people, a lot of newspapers, scientists, some of the public ridiculed this whole thing, they called it Star Wars. And it's oftentimes still referred to as Star Wars, so that's not the official name of it. When people talk about Reagan's Star Wars program or the Star Wars initiative, they're talking about SDI. When people called it Star Wars, kind of saying that this was pure fantasy, that it was kind of something out of a science fiction novel that was completely unobtainable. Nevertheless, that kind of talk, and there is a lot of money that is spent on research and development. Obviously this is not ever developed or deployed, but the research and development does start happening, and that kind of massive military spending does start happening, which does put a lot of strain on the Soviet Union in the end. So tensions are in the early 80s made perhaps a little bit heightened because of Reagan's harsher rhetoric and this increased spending. But as we're going to see on Monday, we will see things start to soften more towards the mid-'80s, particularly when there's some leadership changes and some policy changes in the Soviet Union. So we'll come back to some of this stuff in a moment. Now, with the Soviet Union, you have this very, very harsh line. But another area where Reagan is going to get involved in some conflicts and cause some controversies is in Central America and Latin America. We haven't looked too much at the United States' policy in Latin America specifically in a while, though it's always been a matter of interest. We just haven't looked at any specific examples here. But in the Americas, in Central America, this became a great international concern, particularly to Reagan, who really saw communism and felt communism was a very, very big threat to the United States in Central America. And so he takes some specific actions in Central America to try to support oftentimes bloody dictators, but those that happen to be friendly to the United States and that at least claimed to be fighting communism. We've seen similar things happen before in other parts of Latin America as well. During the Reagan administration, that happens in Nicaragua, where there was a revolution and a insurgency against a pro-American government there. So this revolution in Nicaragua was being led by a group called the Sandinistas. The Sandinistas were these anti-American revolutionaries. We talked in the past that there's been, ever since going back to the Monroe Doctrine, there had been a long-standing pattern of a lot of American intervention and in some cases meddling into Latin American affairs. And that had created a very anti-American attitude amongst a lot of Central American people. And Sandinistas were some of those that were fed up with the United States always sticking their nose in their business and all that sort of thing, and upset and angry that, the United States was supporting and in some cases helping to install and prop up very unpopular leaders, dictators, people that were not very good, and people that, human rights violations and the like, all that sort of stuff. So the Sandinistas overthrow that pro-American dictator in the late 70s and are leading this revolution through Nicaragua. So in response to that, and not wanting the Sandinistas to win, not wanting this anti-American group, these revolutionaries to take over in Nicaragua, President Reagan authorizes the American support and training for a group that will become called the Contras. The Contras are the pro-American side. These are the pro-American guerrillas that the CIA is going to train to fight in Nicaragua and to fight against the Sandinistas. So the CIA is training these anti-communist Nicaraguans to fight the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. So here we have again the United States intervening, training these people, and some would argue orchestrating or supporting or egging on, being kind of behind this conflict in Nicaragua. So, critics would have argued that this was the United States sticking its nose in places where it didn't belong, but also supporting these Contras who could be quite brutal. That they were just killing, that these were fanatics, they were right-wing fanatics that were killing civilians, that were initiating all kinds of ugly bloodshed, but the United States was supporting it because they claimed to be fighting the people that we don't like, that whole thing. It becomes a very controversial situation in Nicaragua, and it also gets related to this other major national mess, and probably one of the darker spots of the Reagan presidency is what becomes known as the Iran-Contra scandal or Iranian-Contra scandal, or affair, sometimes that word gets used. So this is going to be related to that, while also related to something going on in Iran. You may be going, what in the world does Nicaragua and all this have to do with Iran and the Middle East? Well, it's kind of complicated. Well, the background to this, the United States has been interested in the Middle East, certainly, after World War II, because of oil and all those kind of things. The United States has had an interest in what was going on in Middle Eastern countries and wanting to make sure that leaders in charge of those countries were pro-American and things like that, and that's not always what happens. Remember, last thing we talked about with Iran was we had a pro-American government in Iran for decades and decades. And then in the late 70s, that was overthrown with the Shah of Iran was overthrown, and a Islamic fundamentalist, very anti-American government took control in Iran, which remains in control even today. And then Iran is involved in a war with their neighbor Iraq. So early 80s, Iran and Iraq are fighting out. The United States is supporting Iraq because we don't like Iran. And then at the same time, that whole thing is going on and mess is going on in Nicaragua, which Reagan wanted more support for the Contras, wanted more intervention, wanted the United States to get more involved in it, wanted more financial aid and more assistance to the Contras in Nicaragua. Congress would not authorize it. So the Reagan administration, some people in Reagan's administration, some of his aides to this and leaders of different, some of these people's job titles not really relevant to all of this, they come up with this way to try to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. And they do that by illegally selling weapons to Iran. So they are legally selling military supplies, weapons to Iran, all the while the United States is publicly supporting Iraq. They do this, it's illegal because there were congressional bans on selling weapons in this manner. And using that money from those illegal arms sales and funneling that money to the Contras in Nicaragua. So that's how the two things get connected. So basically illegally selling weapons to Iran, using that money to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. Despite, again, congressional bans on any kind of aid to Nicaragua, and while publicly the United States is supporting Iraq in their conflict. The deal is there's another situation I didn't even talk about some stuff going on in Lebanon and Iran. There were American hostages being taken by the Lebanese, and Iran was supposed to help negotiate the end or return those American hostages. That was kind of their end of the deal here. Well, this whole thing eventually gets broken. The story gets broken in the press. This is all going on. And of course, there's all kinds of big scandal that there were, people in the Reagan administration are illegally doing all this, and the president must have authorized it. What did he know? It becomes a great big thing. And people demanding to know what all the president authorized, if he had anything to do with it. You could think of the president, he did. And there were investigations and all sorts of things. There was found to be, and in those investigations, it was just a lot of finger pointing. Who authorized what, all that was rather unclear. Reagan claimed he didn't know anything about it, or he never told this person to do that, and all that sort of stuff, which showed, part of Reagan's leadership style was he was a delegator. He tended to perhaps even over-delegate to people as opposed to doing a lot of stuff that perhaps the president maybe should have done. But it did, so Reagan himself was never found in any of the investigations or any of the things that came to light as a result of this. Reagan always said that it was innocent wrongdoing, that maybe some stuff was done that shouldn't have been done, but it was not intentional, or that it wasn't an attempt to break the law or anything, and that it was mainly out of people's ignorance and miscommunication and stuff like that. Reagan himself was never found to outright lie about anything, but it did become a little bit of a stain on his presidency and brought up a lot of questions. And as they investigated it, there was a lot of other stuff that concerned people. I talked about Reagan sleeping through staff meetings and not really knowing what was going on. And, some of his critics argued that he was nothing but an actor that just played the part of president well, but really didn't know what he was doing and was just delegating those things to other kinds of people. So it did cast some concern about Reagan's abilities, his fitness for office, all those kind of things. However, Reagan, despite all of this, remains incredibly popular, still remains one of the most popular presidents there's ever been. Leaves office, when he does leave office, one of the most popular presidents there's ever been. So this becomes one of the more controversial things. There's still a lot of questions surrounding it. And a few people were found to have done something wrong, only I think one went to jail at least for a couple of months or something. Like I said, he remained pretty popular the entire time. So Reagan, again, remains still an incredibly popular president. As far as some of the things that he was able to do, he definitely, I think it's safe to say, kind of restores the stature of the presidency. There had been a great, mistrust of the government and mistrust of that office. Not to say that Ford and Carter did anything to worsen that, but they really didn't restore it either. And Reagan definitely does that. Plays a key role in moving the nation towards a more conservative agenda. He doesn't dismantle the welfare state like he kind of talked about, didn't fulfill all his campaign promises like he wanted, but he does help end that period of stagflation that had been happening, throughout the 1970s that seemed to be unending. It sets in motion a great economic expansion that happens over several decades, and does help to end the Cold War, which is what we will be talking about on Monday and seeing how that all unfolds. Okay, so questions or anything there? I'll turn this off.